Ah, all right. Are we ready to go? Cool, okay, welcome back everybody. Pretend that you all just came in and haven't been sitting there awkwardly. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Maia Miller. Maia is the accessibility lead at Catalyst. Please make her feel welcome.
Kia ora, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, there you go. Thank you very much for having me. Welcome back from lunch. I'll try to be lively and interesting, but if you do pass out from your food coma, it's okay. I don't take it personally, I understand. So yeah, I'm the accessibility lead at Catalyst, and I'm also a front-end dev. And I've been doing other professions before getting into IT. And the thing that I've found the place that I've always found myself in professionally is in this place between people who know things and people who don't know things, and acting as that bridge between those two groups of people. And so that's the inspiration behind this talk here. So with that, conjure up, have you ever been at a social event, so a family dinner or a party, and then somebody comes up to you and asks, so what do you do for a living? And then you take a big breath and you're like, okay, so this is what I do. And you start. And they're like, yeah, they're with you, sort of, yeah. And then you keep going and you sense that you're kind of losing them, but they're still with you, you're going. And then like slowly it's fading. They just don't really understand what you're asking. And by the end of it, you're not really sure if they caught everything that you were saying. But so you finish and then you ask, so did that make sense? And then they go, yeah, totally, got it. So I'm sure we've all been in those kinds of situations, whether that's those social settings where we're describing what we're doing, or in more formal client meetings and we're trying to explain the process that we chose, or a project that we're working on. So as technical people, we often find ourselves in situations where we're explaining things. You see, like I said, in social settings where people don't quite understand, or they hear that you're a technical person and then they say, okay, so can you explain, and then this technical thing that's not really related to what you do, but they want to know anyway. In client meetings, the client, they're experts in their own field, so they come to you and want you to solve a problem for them. And so you need to explain how you're going to solve the problem. Or you need to explain why you're pushing back on something that they're asking for. And then also our less technical or less experienced coworkers, we're trying to explain, this is the approach that we decided to take as a team, and you need to explain the concept to them. So we often find ourselves in these kinds of situations. And so that's when I want to bring in the analogy. So this is going to be a tool that we can use in our communication toolkit. So, what is an analogy exactly? So I have one for you. So this is a question that I get a lot as a front-end dev. People hear that that's what I do, and they say, oh, that's cool. So what exactly is front-end? I've heard about it, and I've heard of back-end. Like, what exactly? I don't understand exactly what that is. So I like to use the analogy of a car. So when you come into, and you got your key, and you go into your car, and you sit down, and then you see in front of you, you got your dashboard, you have, with little gauges on it for measuring things, a button for volume and AC stuff. You got your steering wheel in front of you, and then you have your key, and you can take your key, and you can put it in the ignition, and then you can turn it. And you turn the ignition to different degrees, and you get different feedback based on the kinds of ways that you're turning the key. So you turn the key once and things start to light up a little bit and you're like, cool, things are working. And then you turn it some more and then you feel some rumbling happen. So you can feel the ignition go off and then it kind of goes into the engine under the hood. Some magic happens there and then it comes back based on the kind of grumbles that you get back from the car. You know whether it worked or whether you have to kind of look twice and figure out what happened. So that's how I like to explain what the front end and the back end is. So everything that's sort of in front of you when you're sitting in a car, that's the front end. That's what you're interacting with as a driver, as a user. So you got buttons and different things that you can see. And then you're using the tools that you have, which is your cursor or your key, and you're engaging the ignition, and that's talking to the engine under the hood. And that's our back end. And there's a bunch of magic that happens back there, so that when you're giving it feedback, it's taking it in, doing some processing, and then communicating back to you through those grumbles. And that's the relationship that you as a user have with the front end, and then the relationship that the front end has with the back end. And in total, your car is basically a website, is an app. That's how that works. So what exactly happened there in that story? So basically, an analogy is explaining an unfamiliar concept in terms of a familiar one. So in that case, taking something that somebody didn't understand about a front end and a back end and use something as simple as a car. So what makes for a good analogy? That's what we're going to be talking about. So first, let's understand why, though, right? You're like, yeah, okay, I guess. So the reasons why I like to talk about analogies is that it can really help enhance or actually succeed at teaching something. If you've been in those conversations where you're going around and around trying to explain something to people and they're just not really understanding, an analogy can be that thing that really allows the penny to drop and allows them to click and to understand what you're talking about. Analogies can be really, really useful in training and in teaching. So if you find yourself in those more formal formats, you can insert analogies into what you're already saying, and that can be helpful for your students. It can inspire and breathe life into something that can be perceived as dry or boring or technical. I know you're not saying anything boring. I know you say everything that's very interesting, but other people might perceive it that way or have difficulty grasping it. So it's something that can really bring it to life. And then it can help creative problem solving. So I was chatting with my friend Bill, and he was saying that he likes to use analogies a lot because he finds that once an analogy is used, people can grab onto it, and you can think about a problem in a new way by being sort of one step removed from it. So that's why analogies. So let's talk about it. You're like, oh, yes, love it, let's do it. So what makes for a good analogy? So I have some tips for you. So tip number 1, familiarity is your friend. So the more familiar, the better your analogy is going to be. The more familiar an analogy your starting point is, the less upfront explanation you need to do. So when I said a car, immediately everybody knew what I was talking about, right? It doesn't matter where you're coming from. It doesn't matter what side of the road you're used to driving on, whether you drive automatic or stick, whether you drive at all, you can conceptually understand what a car is immediately. And all I had to do was tell you which part of the car I want you to focus on. So there was not a lot of explanation required. We can dive right in. That's really handy. The simpler it is the more familiar it is also the simpler for your listener to bring it to mind, to conjure it up. So again, it was really quick for you to come up with, and we can move swiftly. And then likewise, as the explainer, it's easier for me to think through the analogy as well as expand upon it. So the car analogy, for example, so I used it to explain a front end and a back end. And when I explaining this to my coworkers, people actually got really excited about the analogy and was like, oh yeah, and then it's like UX is, that key and how that key actually works and what kind of feedback you're getting from the car and what the dashboard looks like. And then the design team comes in because they decide what color it is. And because it's a really familiar concept, it's really easy to expand upon it and allow us to think more creatively about it. So that's why we like that. So some examples of things that are familiar, that are good grounds to work off of when you're trying to come up with an analogy. So things like houses and the places that you frequent often. So it's like a kitchen. It's like the living room. It's like your neighborhood, something like that. Really easy you can think of. Common tasks and chores. So it's like going grocery shopping or going to the bank. And simple or simplified physical systems. So again, a car, I didn't go into the details of how a car works. I just simplified it. Also I have there like plumbing, liquids go in one way, they come out the other. You could have a blockage somewhere in between. That's a pretty simplistic version of what plumbing is, but that can be pretty effective and visually understandable. Bodies, we all have bodies. So if you say it's something like your body, even if you're a person who can't walk, you can understand the concept of walking. So it's something that's really easy to attach to and to understand. So we like familiar things. That's my first tip. Familiarity is your friend. Okay, let's get another analogy. Another question that I've gotten before is, what's the difference between the different frameworks? So I was talking to my mom a little while ago, and I was telling her I was working on a React project, and now I've got changed into an Angular project, so I have to learn something new. And so it's like an interesting and new challenge. And so she's like, oh, so are you you're doing a new language? And I was like, no, it's not quite learning a new language. Okay, how do I explain what a framework is and the change between frameworks for my mom? And now I know React and Angular, they're not frameworks, it's libraries, whatever, I get it. But that's not the point. So the analogy that I gave to my mom is about sports, or the idea of sports. So if you squint and squint your head this way, all sports are most sports are kind of the same, in that you have that's true. So if you squint and basically you have two teams that are facing each other. There's a ball of some sort that's going back and forth between the two sides, and both sides are trying to score points, and then the points are tallied in the end. Essentially is what sports are, and we can go into detail after that. And so that I like to use as an analogy. So with that, I can choose, if I want to play a game, I can pick up a ball and go kick it around, and then try to find other people who want to kick a ball around me, and then explain to them how exactly the rules are about kicking that ball around. Or I can pick up sport that already exists, and if I do, I'll find people who know how to play already very quickly. I won't have to explain how to play the game. I'll find a community, maybe leagues already. I'll find people who know how to play and can teach me how to play better, and equipment and facilities that already exist on how to play that game, instead of me having to do it from scratch. And that's sort of like JavaScript, in that every time I start a new project, I can pick up the vanilla JavaScript and start from scratch. And there's some liberties in that, right? Like if I kick a ball and I can do anything that I want, and same with vanilla JavaScript, I can do anything that I want within the limitations of JavaScript alone. But if I take a framework, then I get a lot of benefits that come from a framework. So yeah, I'm limited in exactly the kinds of ways I can use that framework, but I find a community, I find packages already existing, I find startup things that you can whip up an app really quickly with create React app. So there's a lot of advantages that come with that. So that's sort of the difference. And then with that analogy and with that, React and Angular are sort of two different sports. And you pick those different sports for different reasons, depending on if I might play soccer if I'm outside and I have X number of people who are playing with me, or this limited amount of equipment. Or I might pick basketball if I have a bouncy ball and a concrete floor, and then maybe it's just two of us, so basketball can be really good for just one-on-one kind of things. So different frameworks have different advantages, and based on the circumstances that we're dealing with, we pick different frameworks in the same way that we play different sports. So my tip number 2 for giving analogies is to keep it concrete. So it's best to have something that the listener can visualize. So in that analogy, I talked about sports, and you can think about different sports. And as I'm saying the different sports, you can picture them as well. Soccer, basketball, you know what they look like, and so you can visualize them. What we want to avoid particularly is to make sure that we're not explaining our abstract idea with another abstract idea. So, if I say, this thing, it's like gravity. So, the centrifugal force of this, and the size of the planet with the atmospheric and all that stuff, it's a lot of cognitive load, basically. And what we want to try to do is to ease that cognitive load, allow people to use the right side of their brain by visualizing things, because they're using the left side of their brain to understand what you're saying. So when we're spreading out that load, it's easier for them to keep up with you and understand. efficient because they're not using just one part of their brain to do everything. So that works in our favor to share that cognitive load. In the same vein, we want to avoid jargon. I could talk a lot about language use and how we use it, and this can be tricky sometimes to find different ways of explaining things. But the idea behind not using jargon, at least as much as possible, is that jargon is another thing that somebody has to remember, basically. So if you just taught me a new term for something, and then you're explaining an additional thing, so now I have to remember this new term that you told me, and then, okay, you're continuing on, and, oh, and you just used that term. Okay, so what was that? What did that mean? Okay, that meant this. Okay, cool, now you're continuing. Hold on, I need to remember now where you are with this and how those connect together. It's just another thing for our listener to remember. So as much as possible, we want to use language that they will already know. And again, this has to do with cross-cultural as well, right? Talking about the familiarity, using language that everybody understands will make it easier for your listener to understand. Okay, since you asked so nicely, we'll do another analogy. So another question I get, again, as a front end, we often get, so what's the difference between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? And so you might have heard this analogy before. I like to compare it to a house, building a house. So when we first start, we build the beams and the foundation of the house. So we stack up all the beams, and then we say, designate, okay, this is a room here, this is a door frame, this is another room, these are the boundaries of the house. And so that's basically the HTML. It sets up the structure of our page, just like the beams set up the structure of the house. The next we have the CSS, or the decorating. So once our house has that structural foundation there, we'll go in and we'll paint the walls, we'll lay down a carpet, we'll hang some curtains, and we'll make it look like it, right? So it's the difference between designating that room as a living room and making it feel like a living room. So that's what CSS does. It makes our page actually look like how we want it to look like. And then the last thing is the JavaScript. That's, at the end, we bring the parts that we interact with our house. So we'll bring the doors, and we'll make sure that the doors can actually open and close, windows can open and close, things like that. And so that's when JavaScript comes in and allows us to interact with the web. So my tip number 3 is to get it about 80% accurate. Because really with that analogy, it's not totally accurate, right? Like CSS, you can do animations with CSS, right? JavaScript can control the HTML structure, and so can have an influence on that. So it's not entirely accurate, actually. But the idea is the main concept is there. So when it comes to analogies, analogies are often a compromise between storytelling and accuracy. And this is something that people often get caught up on. Basically, you want to be accurate and you want to be correct in what you're saying. But if you're going to explain something 100% accurately, you're basically just explaining the thing itself. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a step away from it, create a picture so that people can understand that picture, and then we can come back and talk about the details. Because the reality is that if you're at the level of using an analogy to explain a concept, the details probably don't actually matter as much as you might think they do. And the important part is to get everybody on the same page about the broad strokes, the main principles, and then to go from there. So once I've told people, or told my question asker what the difference between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript like a house, then they might say, yeah, Maya, but I thought that you can do animations with CSS. That doesn't hold up. And then I can say, yeah, actually, so that's when the analogy stops, and now we can talk more about CSS animations, since you have that knowledge there, and you want to go into that depth. Maybe I throw in another analogy, a new one. But the point is, I'm focused on the main concept, and I'm thinking about that concept, and has that main concept come across? That's my focus when it comes to analogies. So then, I just have a 4th tip about storytelling. So first off, analogies are hard to come up with. So please borrow and steal them. I gave you some, please take them. You might have some of your own, please share them with each other. They're hard to come up with, so we might as well, resource share. We all facing the same questions when we come to parties, so we might as well help each other out. And so when it comes to storytelling, I basically have 2 tips or 2 stages that I tell these stories, and if you reflect on the storytelling, that's how I did it as well. So first I start with the familiar, and then I explain how that works. So I told you about the car, and so you're visualizing the car or the house. And then starting with familiar ground so that my listener is comfortable. They are like, yes, I'm with you. You know, I haven't lost them yet. They know what I'm talking about. They have something concrete to work with. And then I draw connections from there. So then I start to say, so that car, so that key, for example, is like a button that you would press. And then the person's like, oh yeah, okay, I understand what an ignition is. I understand what a button is. So that's how I recommend doing that storytelling in that way. So finally, just some takeaways. So as knowledge bearers, it's our job to communicate information to others. The very nature of our jobs and the very nature of the information means that people can't always meet us halfway. It's just the information that we have is highly expertise and technical, and it means that as much as our listener wants to meet us halfway, the reality is that they can't always. So it's our jobs to come to their level, or not level, to come to where they are and meet them where they are, using plain English and stories that they can understand. Analogies are one of the tools for your communication toolkit, so you can pocket that and you have that. And then analogies, what makes a good analogy is if it's familiar, if it's concrete, and then also if it's aiming for the mostly accurate. That's what we're trying to do. And ultimately, essentially what we're trying to do is to ease the cognitive load. We're starting with the familiar, and then we're working off from there. Cool, so thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear your examples. I'm happy to take questions as well. And yeah, either now or later to share your examples of analogies would be really cool. Cool, kia ora.
Awesome, thank you so much, Maya. We do have time for one or two analogies, if they're quick. Grant, is it a joke?
No. Thanks for that great talk, Maya. One analogy that someone shared with me a while ago was explaining technical debt. And they said, if you imagine this development foundry, all these devs working away, is a kitchen, technical debt is doing the dishes. And you could keep cooking. If you never did the dishes, you're going to have a real problem real soon.
Nice. I think that's relatable.
I like that one a lot, actually. Anyone else have a... Oh.
I have a question.
Yeah.
But first, I want to say that you're the second person this week that tells me that only sports that are with balls are sports. So I found really interesting. And I think you're right. Yeah, totally. I have a question. I have a problem. Like when you started your talk with this question about like someone asking you about what you do. So my problem is that people ask me what I do, and then I explain I'm a full stack programmer, and that's what it means, like front end and back end. I explain a little bit, and then basically then someone ends up asking, oh, can you help me? I have some problem with my computer.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, or printer or whatever. I have some problem with Microsoft Word, or I don't know. So how can I use analogies to explain to them that actually I can't fix their Microsoft Word problems or their printer?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm really annoyed. It happens so often.
I mean, I would use an analogy. The one that comes quick to mind, and apologies if it doesn't like work, but like, oh no, that doesn't work actually. But like, what I was thinking about is like a building, and so there's like a construction crew that builds the building, and I'm the interior designer, so I designed all these chairs and the seating to make it look like this, and you know, the inside of this building. And so if you have a problem with the chair that you're sitting on, or the colors don't really look nice, you can come to me and I can fix it. But typically that's usually actually not you, that's usually the company that comes to me and I fix it. But if there was a problem with the building itself, I can't help you with that. So it's just basically, it's a different area of computers and IT kind of thing. Yeah, I would explore different analogies, and so in coming up with that, think about the tips that I gave about something familiar. So pick something about, you know, pick your body. How do you use your body to explain the differences between what you do and what fixing a printer is, something like that, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, that was a perfect example. My husband is a structural engineer, and he's one of the people that ask me all the time, all the time.
Thank you so much. Tim, did you have a question? No, I was wondering if I better get you to say it into the microphone. Jeez.
Thanks, Maya. I was wondering if physical things are sort of innately easier for people to kind of grasp. A lot of your analogies are buildings or the kitchen or the car, and is it something about the spatial aspect that's really easier to understand?
Yeah, I would think so. Like, the more tangible it is, the more helpful it is. Yeah, so answer yes.
Cool, that's all the time we have for today. Please join me in thanking Maya once again.